بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا وقدوتنا محمد عليه أفضل الصلاة وأزكى التسليم. اللهم علمنا بما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Everybody near and far, welcome to Reforming the Self with Raghib Asfahani's Dhariyah ila Makarim Shariah. Last two lessons have been very, very important. And I've also tried to do a better job of condensing the material of the author, because sometimes the author is so theoretical and categorical that you can kind of get lost. And so I've tried to just distill some of the things he's saying into the more hard-hitting points and the more instructive and profound kind of messages. And the two previous, I should say the biggest ones we've taken away in the last month have been essential characteristics for students and essential characteristics for teachers. And if you all have been following along, then you should remember some of them. Do you have any? Or some of the essential characteristics for a student or a teacher, and I'll be very, very lenient with you. That's right. Yes, that's right. Maybe we could say the most important thing for a teacher is to be able to discern who's going to use the superpowers of knowledge for good and who's going to use them for evil, and to prevent those who would use them for evil as much as possible, until, not indefinitely, but until they're ready for it, until they're able to have the realization, understand their context in this universe, understand their relationship to their creator, subhanahu wa ta'ala, to be able to properly receive and utilize those sorts of instruction. Okay, so that was probably the most important one for teachers. What about for students? We're all students. I'm a student. All of you are tied to some sort of educational institution in some way. You guys are perfect students? Or do you guys completely free of the qualities of good students, and so you don't know? Interested in learning. Okay, well, that's a start, I guess. If only interest were enough, right? What else is there? What must a student be? Engaged. Okay, you clearly weren't following the lessons because we didn't talk about it. Okay, student has to be humble. That's first and foremost. Student has to submit themselves. And this is kind of a tricky process. It's a two-way street, right? There's bum teachers out there. There's phonies. There's people who take advantage, right? They put themselves on a pedestal as some sort of guru, and then next thing you know, they're in the news because they did something crazy. And then there's also rotten students who they are completely arrogant towards the subject material, towards a teacher. They think they know better. And so they would be similar to somebody who's going to a doctor and telling them whatever they think they want to hear in order to get a certain prescription, right? They're cooking the books. They're trying to they think they know best, right? And they're just trying to use the authority of the teacher for their own ends. And you would be surprised how often that exists everywhere in the Muslim world, including Medina. So that was one thing that we had talked about. And then, yes, the author had gotten into kind of this decentering understanding. And it was amazing that it coincided with the khutbah the other week, because we in Western academia and culture, we tend to assume that understanding and education is mostly about intelligence, right? Those two things are like joined at the hip, right? If you don't understand, sorry, maybe take up forestry or something. It's a little bit above your pay grade, and maybe you're not intelligent enough for it. Whereas the Islamic kind of worldview, understanding is a gift from Allah, subhanahu wa ta'ala, and He can give anybody that gift, whether they match the kind of traditional markers of intelligence or not, right? So it's more of a function of character. And so the author was trying to shift us away from kind of sorting people as, this guy's a dummy and this guy is brilliant, which does kind of invite self-praise right? And it does kind of invite this sort of arrogance and shifting us over to like, this person Allah has granted success. This person Allah has granted understanding. And if you go to the biographical works of the Salaf, and the early scholars, there's tons of, apocryphal stories of other like very intelligent scholars who fell into sin and then were caused basically to forget everything that they once knew. Even people who stood up to recite the Quran, they used to have the entire Quran memorized, and all of a sudden their understanding and memorization was taken away from them, because it is at the end of the day a gift given to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So after he goes through that, he's going to shift to talking about society. And if we know anything about Raghib Asfahani at this point, he sees things big picture, right? He's interested in the individual project, right? He's been selling us the whole time on the need for respecting the aql, the intellect, and developing the aql, but it's all geared towards something. It's not just so that we can have nice resumes and, get accolades from this and that society or that fraternity or that whatever. It's so that we can actually establish a just society, a society that Allah would be pleased with, right? And this is in all of our self-interest, because first of all, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows a just society to continue. Right? He doesn't punish it either through, dramatic divine punishment, nor through allowing another superpower or world power to overcome it. Even, and I can't remember the text, but I believe that Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will allow a disbelieving society, if they are just, to exist and to stick around until they turn away from justice. That's how much Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves justice. Whereas even if you have a civilization who nominally believes in Islam, follows something that might look like Islamic civilizational culture, once they turn away from justice, it's only a matter of time between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lets them be overrun by somebody. And we see this with the Mongols, we saw it happen with, the civilization after civilization. To put it short, the Muslim world has been overrun by colonialism and all these sorts of waves of oppressors, largely due to the turning away from justice. And so Raghib al-Asfahani's project is very much on this like scale of history. Like he's trying to not just build an individual, but realizing that by building individuals, you're also building society. And so now he's going to talk about kind of this ecosystem of influencers, right? We use the word influencer these days to talk about people on Instagram and TikTok, and I can lip sync to some certain song and put myself up on TikTok, and I'm an influencer, right? He's talking about influencers at a more pure stage in history, where things were kind of a little bit more sensible, even if the spiritual diseases were still the same. So he identifies, first of all, he puts a lot of responsibility on the ultimate political authority, whatever it is, president, king, emperor, whatever it is, because the buck has to stop somewhere. And that person is at the end of the day responsible for setting the tone in society as to what the society is going to be about. Is it going to be about entertainment, which is pretty much our society at this point, pretty much about entertainment and fulfilling our base desires? Is it going to be about virtue? Is it going to be about education? Is it going to be about some sort of other civilizational achievement, whether it's in architecture or this or that, right? So the buck has to stop somewhere, and it stops with the ultimate leader when it comes to setting the tone. However, that person does not have so much reach. That person is only able to influence things so far. At the local level, in every community, there are different stations of influencers, and there's different types of influencers. And the author's trying to show us how, in a functional society, these influencers, they all complement each other, right? Because there's different types of people. So he identifies four. He says the biggest, perhaps, type of influencer are the prophets, okay? And what is the reach of the prophets? The prophets, they influence our internal lives and our external lives. Okay, so there's internal, externals, kind of his categories. And also they influence the masses and the elites. So he has four total categories he's looking at through, right? There's some that are going to reach the masses, some that are going to reach the elite, some that are going to reach both. There's some influencers that are going to change the way you think about your life and the way in which you see the world around you. And then there's some that are going to set rules and laws that are going to kind of govern the external part of your life, right? Like the speed limits I always talk about in the khutbah, right? So the prophets are at the top because the prophets, they influence all of those areas. They influence your internal life, right? What your sense of what's going to happen to you after you die, your beliefs, right? How you feel about certain behaviors, etc., 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 right? A lot of the guilt that might come from having committed a sin, a lot of that is partially given to us by the guidance of the Prophet ﷺ, who told us that this sort of thing is going to have X and Y and Z consequence in the afterlife, right? So the prophets influence everything, all four categories. Politicians, on the other hand, that's number two. Politicians influence what? Okay, so we've got four categories. So we've got masses, elite, internal, external. So a politician is going to hit how many of those categories? Masses, elite, external. Yes, 3 out of the 4, right? They can't really shape your inside. Maybe like one, random person Bernie Sanders might be an inspiration for some people, but like the vast majority of politicians, we have Congress. I shouldn't say anything on this, should I? It's recorded. Okay. The other politicians, they're not necessarily going to be like your beacon of guidance for morality and stuff like that. You're not going to get up in the morning and think, oh, thank God that person's our X, Y, and Z, this particular office or that particular office. They govern the external. They say that these are the rules you have to follow. If, we're not going to get mail on Sundays or Saturdays, or you need to have this degree if you want to go here, or this is going to have a stoplight at this particular intersection. All these external parts of our lives. The third type of influencer is what the author calls the sages, okay? And by the sages, he's talking about people who influence the elite on the inside, okay? So he's talking about people who are kind of like, maybe you would consider the saints, or people who have that kind of, they're able to motivate people, but they have a particular appeal to the elite intelligentsia, the academic class, whatever have you. And then the last type, he says, are the orators and the khatibs, okay? And of all the 4 categories we have, what do we think the orators are going to affect? The masses, okay, so no elite, yes, masses. Internal, external? Internal, that's right. Internal, masses. So between the 4 of them, you've kind of got multiple vectors of influence, okay? And the ideal is that there's a connection between these 4 types of influencers. The ideal is that the orators are going back to the sages, right? And the sages depend on the orators to kind of translate certain insights into the local idiom that people will be able to understand, right? You can draw an example from rap, right? And hip hop. This is something that's so influential. It literally, like, people are mouthing the words to songs that people make like multiple hours a day, a week, a year, right? That's something with tremendous amounts of influence. It's something that touches the masses, doesn't really touch the elite, right? If this group of people does go off on their own, does not have any connection with, say, the sages or the prophets, right, or these other types of influencers, then it might degenerate into what we find just base entertainment, hedonism, shock value, right? All these sorts of things that we see. But if we can imagine a parallel universe, and in other times of history, there was hip hop, where individual artists were influenced by larger objectives, right? They were influenced by certain religious and spiritual movements, and so they were attempting to achieve some sort of social edification or social good, right? That's a little bit of a modern day example of what the author might have been kind of shooting for. And similarly with the politicians, et cetera, et cetera. If you have virtuous politicians who have a relationship with the sages and have a relationship with the orators, then you have people that are actually public servants, right? People that are actually prioritizing the good of people making legislation and making laws that are supposed to make people's lives better, more valuable, easier, more fulfilling, and not just enriching themselves, and let alone the corruption, et cetera, et cetera. So you can often tell how well a society is functioning by the relationships or lack thereof between these different types of influencers. And today, with the type of influencers, okay, if we were to use the authors for kind of categories, internal, external, masses, elite, if we're going to look at TikTok and Instagram and things like that, where would we place the influencers on social media? Where would they fit into the picture? Masses, okay. Internal, external? External? I think it's internal, right? Because external is like things you have to do. Yeah, things you're forced to do, rules, right? They're not setting rules for anyone. It's like, the ice bucket challenge or whatever, right? So no one's forcing you to take that challenge or whatever it's called when you dance next to your car or whatever. That's all internal motivation, not external obligation. So internal masses. So they align with the orders. They're the orders in the author's kind of calculus of things. So this is really interesting to think about this, our modern day orators with the authors kind of way back, he wrote 1,000 years ago, which probably for him were like the khatibs on Friday and the poets and stuff like that. Now, his next section is who's fit to be an orator, right? What are the qualities that somebody should have to have before they have access to those people? They're able to influence people's internal motivations. They're able to, which is the purest form of influence, because you can make a law and someone might follow your law. But as we've said in the khutbah before, the second you're not looking, you think people are going to follow that law? No, of course not. They don't. People are only following it so they don't get in trouble. Whereas internal motivation, that person is convinced, something clicked inside of them, you reach them somehow so that it's self-policed. Like they're the one that wants to do it, right? Like they're the one that feels the social pressure to take the ice bucket challenge or this challenge or that challenge or whatever it is. No one's forcing them. So it's a powerful thing. And it's kind of become very lucrative, which is why so many people dream of becoming sort of like an influencer, because you've got so much reach, you've got so much influence, and now it's also a moneymaker. So his next section is who's fit, which is a question that we don't even think of these days because it's not about fitness, it's just about who does it, right? Nobody stops and says, it's like, well, wait a second, am I really fit to have a TikTok account with all these followers? Or am I really fit to, have such a big following on Instagram? And no, you have every single, Tom, Dick, and Harry up there who wants to have an account, who there's a glut. People are throwing out things, trying to influence, and then it's just by popularity contest who actually becomes somebody who is an influencer. So the author wades into, okay, if we're going to say that these people have this influence, and this influence can be used for good, it's not necessarily an evil thing. What are the essential characteristics that such a person has to have? I'll put it to you. What do you think? What should someone with such access and influence have in their lives? Charisma and passion. Okay. Okay. So a sort of social intelligence. Yeah. Proper intention. What's going to happen if they don't?
What they're trying to achieve.
Yeah. They're always going to, let's say, okay, if a person has influence over other people, a proper intention would look like uplifting those people and benefiting those people in some way, teaching them. Like even if we want to not even get into, yes, for Allah and worship and etc. etc. Like even just like very, very dunyawi, right? A good intention might look like wanting to benefit people in some way. Cooking classes or teaching them a language or, and there's a lot of that. So what would a bad intention look like and what are the consequences of that?
Like you said, cooking class, right? Good intention is I want to maybe make people independent, teach them how to cook and all that.
Mm-hmm.
People do feel that when you come to class, you can see that this teacher passionate about it. She wants to teach, she wants to help.
Okay.
That intention is I'm making this class, I'm gonna make a quick buck, get them out, sell my stuff and everything, and
Ah.
do a couple rare parties or whatever.
So instead of a giving, it's a taking. It's a parasitic relationship to the influencer, to the influence.
I'm not coming to your class.
That's right. Hmm.
I'm not going to go, oh, don't go to this one.
Right. Right.
Very intentional saying, like this.
Right. So we have people who are looking to enrich themselves, right? People who are looking to take and abandon, right, from the people that they influence. And then we have people looking to add value to other people's lives with the people that they influence. So that's very good. That's very profound. Talking about people's intentions. One of the things that the author says is that he says that the orator, people that are in this sort of station, they can't be hypocritical. He says that first and foremost. He says they have to practice what they preach, right? Let's take your cooking class. If you get somebody up there trying to teach, mashallah, Indian cuisine or somebody else's cuisine, and you're following their stuff, and they've never cooked a day in their life. They're just up there making jokes. Maybe they're passionate. Maybe they're charismatic to go with the other qualities. But they have not yet put themselves in a place to give anything, right? What's the result going to be? It's just going to be not just a waste of time, but people are going to actually lose trust for this person. They're going to, and this type of person is going to be, let's say, blameworthy in the eyes of people. Okay, well, that's a cute example with cooking, but what if it's a religious person? Yeah, that's where the rubber meets the road. Because if you have somebody who represents a religious station or is trying to represent an entire tradition like Islam, they get on TikTok, they get on whatever, and they try to influence people, and they don't practice what they preach. They're found out now to have done this or done that, or something comes out about them, and we're not talking about slander, we're talking about something real, something that's open and obvious, or they just don't know what they're talking about. That person has not just wasted the time of the people that they influence. They've poisoned the people's trust towards that type of person, right? The next type of religious person that comes along, it's like, oh, is this just another one of these guys? That's just, and we've seen things like this happen, right? Like people have, yeah, perfect example. How many people are bitter and just, yeah, I mean, there's so many even like jokes about it, right? Because it's such a, an epidemic of sexual abuse and things like that. And so how many people, they refuse to trust. The trust is absolutely obliterated. And we live in times where trust is a rare commodity, and that the lack of trust has influenced so many things politically, public health, the pandemic, everything. Many, many, many things come back to trust. The most important thing to trust is the kind of clerical class, the people who are the academic class of the religion. And it's a two-way street. The people on the side of the orators, they have to be trustworthy. They have to have purified themselves. They have to have fixed themselves. Part of why someone like Mufti Menk, for example, to use names, is so accepted is because if you've listened to some of his interviews about himself, like previously, he's done the work. Like he's gone through stuff. He's gone through hardship, and he's been put in the fire, and he's come out of the fire. And he's now just sharing very basic stuff according to, and he's a very charming character. And a lot of people, so many people benefit from his stuff, right? So the opposite, somebody gets up and they're not qualified. They haven't gone through this stuff. They haven't done the work, and they're only going to make a mockery of the station. They're only going to hurt people's trust for that. And regretfully, we see a fair bit of it, at least in the English sphere. I don't know in the Arabic sphere, or even less about the Urdu sphere, how things go. But I'll say that on Muslim YouTube, Muslim Twitter, right, Muslim Facebook, with the Anglo sphere, the English-speaking segment of the world, we have a lot of bickering and a lot of infighting and a lot of reputations and a lot of, you know, oh my God, did you see what he said? And how could he do this and that? And you have to wonder, the average bystander looking at this stuff, right? Not the person who's in the comments, yeah, go get him, you're so right, you know, but the average person who sees this stuff and turns away, what are they coming away looking at the entire station of religious speaker, of student of knowledge, of imam? How are they, you know, making this sort of, what impression are they taking away? I was told a story of somebody who was doing dawah in Japan, and dawah is big in Japan right now. There's like masjids being built and many people becoming Muslims. And so a certain person, they were Japanese, they accepted Islam. And then the first thing someone started telling them was about like the sects. Now it's like Sunni Shia, and within the Sunni you've got this and that and that, and then this and that and that, and all this sort of breakdown. And their reaction was like, whoa, wait a second. This is like, I just wanted to be a Muslim. I didn't want to get involved in all this sort of thing. So it's you know, discretion is important and optics are important, and certain things. We were talking last class about context collapse. Maybe you guys ever heard of this concept in media studies. Context collapse is basically what social media has done to us, because previously you had different identities depending on who you were interacting with, right? So if you interact with your parents, you have a different identity than if you interact with your peers. And you have a different identity if you interact with people younger than you, right? Social media collapses all those different contexts because now everything's broadcasted indiscriminately to everybody, right? So now you have somebody who they might put something out there that is suitable for an academic audience, but it's accessed by everybody, and it's not suitable for that audience, and so it becomes a problem for them. This happens a lot with Islamic lectures and things like that, or vice versa. You know, you have many different sort of ways in which this sort of thing plays out. So all that to say, that's kind of when it comes back to orators, right? What are the qualities that they need to have? They need to practice what they preach. They need to have that discretion. You don't talk with the people that you're influencing, the masses, the same way that you're going to talk with other people if you go back to those sages or you go back to that scholarly class and you're asking them for advice, etc., etc. Everything needs to have kind of a little bit of separation, but cooperation. And he compares it to, he says, somebody who gets up and speaks and tries to influence people before they have taken heed themselves. They're like a doctor who's sick, who's treating a patient. Right? They're only going to communicate their own disease to the patient. They're not even going to be able to. It's worse than not going to be able to heal them. They're going to actually make them sick. And there's a funny story. I don't know if you guys are into Nasruddin Hoja stories or Joha stories, but you guys, do you have a different name for him in South Asia? In Arabic world, they call him Joha, and in Turkey they call him Nasruddin Hoja. Yeah, he's like the kind of the wise idiot figure, and there's all these sort of funny stories. Okay, so one of them is that he's Qadi. Okay, so he's the judge, and the mother comes with her son, and her son is eating too many sweets. Okay, and she's like, Qadi, you know, Nasruddin Hoja, I need you to pass a specific ruling on this boy, banning him, tell him it's haram to eat sweets. And he thinks about it. He's like, oh, this is a tricky case. Okay, come back in a week. Okay, and so the mother comes back with the boy again a week later. So like, Qadi, I need you to intervene. This is out of control. He won't stop eating sweets. He says again, like, come back next week. Right? And he keeps on delaying and delaying and delaying. And then after 3 months go by, he's like, what is this? You've been delaying and buying for time and all this stuff. He's like, today I can finally say, boy, do not eat sweets. It's haram for you. And then she's like, why did it take you so long? He said, well, I had the same addiction and I had to stop myself first. Right. So he had a problem with sweets, and then he had to, right. He felt the need to practice what he was preaching before he could tell somebody else to do the same. This dovetails nicely into the next chapter from the author, Raghib Asfahani. He's talking about optics and how it looks, how the orators and the sages and the politicians and everybody needs to work together, right, as different parts to the same vehicle. and they need to know what conversation should be behind closed doors and which ones should be out in public, and etc., etc. The next chapter is discouraging arguments and debates among laymen in all situations, and even among scholars often. So he says that allowing average people, laymen, masses, to argue about religious topics when they don't know the evidence and they don't even understand what evidence is akin to unleashing demons from hellfire or setting Yajuj and Majuj free. Right? So he basically says that to recruit the masses, people who have not formally studied the religion in a systematic way, right, through a program with a sheikh or through an institute or whatever, to recruit, because it can be tempting. If you're ex speaker or ex imam and you have ex YouTube channel and you've got a certain position, you might feel tempted to recruit, your local congregation onto your side to kind of, make you feel like you're in the right and kind of spar with other people. I'll never forget, I was in a masjid in St. Paul, in Minnesota, and I overheard one of the lay congregants, who was a fairly new Muslim, telling the imam, "I'm so glad I go to the only masjid in the city that's on the haq." That's what, straight from his mouth. And I just, I had to laugh, and feel pity at the same time, and sorry, but also the blame. Where's the blame in that situation? The blame's on the imam in that situation. The imam cannot allow that type of attitude to fester. Exactly. You cannot, and the imam sets the tone, right? If you're going to, you're basically involved in that. You're recruiting your congregants to side with you on certain ideological or theological or fiqh related debates or controversies, etc., etc., etc. You're not doing anybody any good. The people who are your foot soldiers in that war, the congregants who have never studied, they don't know anything about what you're trying to talk about, and it doesn't benefit them. It doesn't benefit them in their afterlife. It creates division among the Muslims. It stops the Muslims from being able to cooperate. Right? You wonder, you see cities like these cities where there's, maybe they're in our city, how many masjids are there? Like 6, 7, 8, maybe more. How much cooperation is between the masjids? Very little. We're just starting to. Me and Emsal have a very good relationship, and Ahmadine also, I have a good relationship with Ahmadine. But that's just we're in baby stages. We're taking baby steps, right? Other cities, they've been in the game for a lot longer. They've been going for decades and decades. Zero cooperation. Never talk to each other, right? Let alone an Eid prayer, let alone a dars or halaqah, let alone switching imams for, at least for us, alhamdulillah, with Court Street, we switch imams. I told the guys, because Emsal was in Bosnia for, the last month and a half. And so I covered for him. And after it was all said and done, they're I said, every once in a while, we should just switch off. Once we have the new masjid up, Emsal come here and I go there, and we kind of just, just to give the people a different flavor. That's cooperation. If you've got people, if I wanted to come in here and be I'm a Medina grad, and these guys, they practice cultural Islam, and they have all these innovations, and try to kind of, stir up the people about, this sort of thing. Okay, that would be almost very easy to do, right? It would make me look really good, but it would be so destructive. It would be so destructive to the fabric of a larger Muslim community. How can you, and I told this to Emsal as well, I said, how can each one of us is too small to do certain things by ourselves. If we have an Islamic school, if we want an Islamic school, do you think that we can do it just Kemble Street Masjid? No chance. Can they do it just Court Street? No way. It's not possible. As we were sitting one day, I said, if we ever do an Islamic school, it's got to be all of us together. And he's like, I completely agree. And alhamdulillah. But these are the things. You cannot, and the buck stops with the imam. The imam cannot allow the congregants in the community to engage in this sort of debate. Ash'ari versus Athari, Sufi versus Salafi, right? I'm sure you guys have tons of divisions in the subcontinent that I don't even know about. Shafi'i versus Hanafi, that's a big one, right? Etc., etc. These things have only served to divide us and make us weak and make us easy prey for people who want to do us harm, both politically abroad and politically here, honestly. And we live in the times today. We live in times now where there are certain people who want to make certain Muslim organizations synonymous with terrorist groups, right? There are certain people in the Muslim world, governments, that want to make the Muslim Brotherhood designated as a terrorist group. Every single MSA in the United States is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, right? That's the organization that started the whole thing. How many masajid in America have some, if you go back far enough, ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, right? So it might be tempting, one particular state or government or ideological movement might want to run to the non-Muslims, curry favor with them, suck up to them to get them to punish their adversaries. And then who wins at the end of the day? Nobody. We're all left scattered and weak and fighting against each other. And that's exactly how we lost Spain. That's exactly how we lost against colonialism, and et cetera, et cetera. Right. Correct. But it takes leadership to manage them. That's the other thing. Because if you don't manage it, then everybody's going to want to split off. And once you start to split off, there's always something else to split off about. And I just know a little bit of the history here, but it's the same everywhere, right? You think that you're only going to split off once because it's for your language. That's never happened, ever. You split off once for the language, then you split off another time because the East versus the West, the North versus the South. Then there's this particular group and that particular group, right? And this is not to say that we don't love masjids. We love masjids, but I would love if they work together. If everybody's working together, we have the same Eid prayers, we have the same, we swap lessons, dars, halaqat, this and that and the other, have a rotational khutbah, sort of cycle, things like that, then you can have as many masjids as you want. But if that's not the scenario, if that's not the case, if there's no cooperation between the Muslims, then it's really not doing us any good. Why is argumentation so poisonous to anybody, especially to the lay people who haven't studied religion systematically? The author says because there are predators, meaning the devils, the influence, the ego, that are going to overpower the intellect and the bounds of the Shariah, right? You don't know going into it what are the bounds of Shariah when it comes to how much you can argue a point. You don't know before coming into it how to conduct yourself, when to agree to disagree. And so people, they're going to latch on to the kind of tribalistic thing, and they're going to end up wronging somebody and wronging themselves, right? By making it into a much, much bigger deal than it has to be. And we see this a lot. People equating the differences between Athari and Ash'ari, or the differences between Hanafi and Shafi, as basically being the same as like the differences between Muslim, non-Muslim, right? And that's a tragedy. That can't happen. And this is something, honestly, that is even on the books with certain low-level scholars if you go back far enough. But it's something that needs to stop. He brings also to buttress his argument, he says that many scholars have penned that debate is disliked even for scholars. So then what about people who aren't trained? It is hoped that scholars who have enough training in the religion will know those bounds of the Shariah and will know those bounds of when to accept the truth, even if it's against what they previously said. But even then, it's not guaranteed. And how many, and I've said this before, how many debates and how many rivalries between different factions, if you trace them back to the root, contemporary, I'm talking about, are honestly just personal disagreements. with egos involved. It happens all the time. Sometimes it's even more dangerous that scholars are the ones arguing, because the scholar is able to cloak a personal issue in religious language and say that, oh, well, no, this person's off the haq, or this person is violated the sunnah, or this person is, subhanAllah, I remember when I was in Medina, my Sheikh Abdullah Shankiti, he, alhamdulillah, one thing I learned from him, he was never involved with this sort of stuff. But there was one particular scholar who's notorious, will remain nameless, who lobbed some criticisms his way towards our sheikh. And the level of anger, I actually heard the other sheikh's voice, right, when he said what he said. And it was so hyperbolic, it was so exaggerated, it was so angry. He says, it's like, anyway, I'll leave it there. But sometimes it can be even worse, right? Like there's one dimension that the author is making us aware of. It's worse for the layman because they don't have the training. But in another dimension, it's actually even worse that some scholars argue and debate because they have enough knowledge to cloak their personal issues in religious language, and that hurts everybody. And as he says, it doesn't result in anything, this type of argumentation, except for enmity between people and rejection of the truth. And that's what everybody, I think, who has engaged in this sort of thing has found. Once you're in an argument, once you're in a debate, you are invested to save face, right? You have kind of put your name on the line to support a certain claim or a certain position or certain opinion. And it takes a very, very spiritually mature person to say, I was wrong, to admit they were wrong, to go back and say, it's like, wow, I completely misunderstood that thing. Now, what if you have hundreds of YouTube followers and thousands of Instagram followers and, maybe 1 million TikTok followers? How hard is it? You would have to be saintly to be able to admit that you were wrong in such an ecosystem that rewards kind of just your brand, right? Your individual brand. So we ask Allah to protect us, subhanAllah. That takes us to the end of the class period. Any thoughts, reflections, questions that you all have? Oh, come on. Give me some.
It's like the story of Imam Ahmad.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And Imam Ahmad, here's an example of cooperation amongst the scholars. Sometimes Imam Ahmad, when he was asked for a certain fatwa, for certain opinions about an issue, and he knew that he had a very strict opinion on something, he would send the person to somebody else who had a more lenient opinion. Right? This is something that is has precedence within the scholarly classes. But yeah, when it came to the mihna, right, the way in which Ahmad was kind of hung out to dry, and there's other things, right, like we find with what was the name, Al-Dahlawi and Imam al-Bukhari, right? You had that rivalry in their own town, and that was something that came. This is like textbook example of what we're talking about, right? Imam al-Bukhari took a position on, I believe it was on the recitation of the Quran, right? Saying that the recitation of the Quran, what was it? That the lafz is, it's not super important. But anyway, he was branded by kind of the local authority as a heretic, and like he was even forcing his students to disavow him, right? And Imam Muslim was a student to both of them, right? Imam al-Bukhari and this other scholar. And so Imam Muslim, in a very, very kind of dramatic way, he stood up in the middle of the class, and Imam Muslim had written down, right, all of these hadith that he learned from this scholar. But once he started talking bad about Imam Bukhari, he took all of those hadith and he returned them. He gave them back. He put them right in front of the sheikh, and he left. And he never went back to his lesson, because that was something to prove a point. That all the stuff that we're doing, it doesn't hold a candle to. It doesn't take priority over the brotherhood of Islam. right? There can be internal issues. We can have internal disagreements, but we have to know, right? We have to keep it in-house. We have to keep it in-house. We can't be going out appealing to the political authorities to, round up X group that disagrees with us, or taking our opportunistic chance to kind of ruin this individual or that individual. And we see way too much of that. And we see a lot of that going on with cancel culture these days. This is kind of like the original cancel culture, right? People try to label you a heretic and say that you're this and that and the other, and try to get you fired and expelled, et cetera, et cetera.
After the initial part,
Sorry?
construct your argument.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. The level of argumentation. That's right. That's fine. Okay. Well done. Thank you all very much for attending. That's a lot of benefit us by this and make it way in our scale for us, not against it.